Lexington, Kentucky, 1820. William Wells Brown was 6 years old the first time he understood what it meant to be property. He stood in the slave quarters of Dr. John Young's estate, watching his mother weep as his older sister was loaded onto a wagon and sold away. They would never see her again. His mother, Elizabeth, was a strong woman who had borne 7 children to the white men who had assaulted her. William was the lightest-skinned of them all, so light that some people mistook him for white. It made him valuable in a cruel market that priced human beings by the shade of their skin. But it also made him dangerous, because a slave who could pass for white was a slave who could escape. "Remember her face," Elizabeth whispered to William that night, holding him close. "Remember all their faces, the ones they take from us, because remembering is how we keep them alive." William never forgot that lesson. Remembering became his rebellion. Dr. Young was not the worst master, but he was far from kind. He worked his slaves hard, provided minimal food and clothing, and believed firmly in the supposed inferiority of black people. But he had one weakness: he was vain about his own intelligence and kept an extensive library. William discovered books at age 8. He was cleaning Dr. Young's study when he saw them, rows upon rows of leather-bound volumes containing worlds he couldn't yet access. He pulled one down and opened it, staring at the mysterious symbols that somehow contained meaning. "Put that back, boy," Dr. Young snapped, entering the room. "That's not for the likes of you." "What do the marks mean, master?" William asked, unable to stop himself. Dr. Young's expression shifted from anger to something like amusement. "Those are words, letters that make sounds that make meaning, but don't concern yourself, it's not something your kind can understand." That night, William made a decision. He would prove Dr. Young wrong. He would learn to read. It took 2 years. 2 years of sneaking moments in the study, memorizing the shapes of letters, matching them to sounds he heard. 2 years of bribing the doctor's children with extra chores in exchange for them telling him what words said. 2 years of scratching letters in the dirt with sticks when no one was watching. But when he was 10 years old, William Wells Brown could read. He kept it secret. Literacy was dangerous for enslaved people. In many states it was illegal. Masters feared literate slaves because literacy meant access to information, to abolitionist newspapers, to the ideas that could spark rebellion. But William couldn't stop. Reading became his lifeline, his secret act of defiance, his window into a world beyond slavery. He read everything he could get his hands on: the Bible, newspapers, Dr. Young's medical journals, and most importantly, he read about places where slavery didn't exist, places where people like him were free. When William was 12, Dr. Young hired him out to work on Mississippi River steamboats. It was common practice. Masters would rent out their slaves' labor and pocket the wages. William spent months at a time on the river, working as a cabin boy, learning the routes, observing how the boats operated. And he met someone who would change his life forever. The man's name was Wells Brown. He was a Quaker, a steamboat captain, and secretly an abolitionist. He was kind to William in a way that few white men had been, treating him with dignity, paying attention when he spoke, never using violence. "You're a smart boy," Wells Brown said one evening as they stood on the deck watching the sunset over the Mississippi. "Too smart to spend your life in chains." William looked at him sharply. Such words were dangerous even from a white man. "I see you reading," Wells Brown continued quietly. "When you think no one's watching, I see you learning, calculating. You're planning something, aren't you?" William said nothing, but Wells Brown smiled. "Good, keep planning, keep learning, and when you're ready, when the moment comes, be brave enough to take your chance." He pressed something into William's hand, a small book. "Hide this, read it when you're alone. It's called Narrative of the Life of James Williams, an American Slave. It's about a man who escaped and told his story, so the world would know the truth." That book changed everything. Reading James Williams's account of slavery, of escape, of freedom, William realized something profound. His story mattered. The truth about what he and millions like him endured, that truth had power. But before he could do anything with that realization, tragedy struck. Dr. Young sold him. William was 15 years old when he stood on an auction block in St. Louis, Missouri, being examined like livestock by potential buyers. His mother had been sold separately weeks earlier. He didn't know where. His remaining siblings had been scattered across 3 states. He was alone. The man who bought him was named Samuel Willie, a merchant who needed workers for his store and his household. Willie was cruel in casual, everyday ways, quick with his fists, generous with insults, convinced of his own superiority. But he was also careless. He often left William alone in the store, surrounded by newspapers and correspondence from business partners across the country. And William, with his hidden literacy, read everything. He learned about the growing abolitionist movement in the North. He read about escape routes and safe houses. He discovered that there were people, black and white, who helped runaways reach freedom. He also learned something that filled him with rage: the truth about his mother. Through fragments of conversation he overheard and documents he secretly read, William discovered that his mother had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi, and within 6 months she had died, worked to death in the cotton fields. The woman who had taught him to remember, who had held him and told him stories, who had survived bearing 7 children to men who assaulted her, she was gone. William wept alone in the store's storage room, his grief overwhelming. But grief transformed into determination. He would escape, he would reach freedom, and he would tell the world the truth about slavery, not just his story but his mother's, his sister's, the millions of stories that were being erased by a system designed to pretend enslaved people weren't human. His chance came in the winter of 1834 when Willie sent him on an errand to deliver goods to a customer near the river. William was 19 years old, strong and desperate. He ran. Not blindly, not without planning. He had studied maps in Willie's office. He knew the river routes from his time on the steamboats. He knew which towns had abolitionist sympathizers and which were dangerous. He made it 30 miles before the slave catchers caught him. The punishment was severe. Willie had him whipped publicly, 30 lashes that tore open his back and left scars he would carry for life. Then he was chained in a cellar for 2 weeks with minimal food and water. "Try to run again and I'll sell you to the worst plantation in Mississippi," Willie promised. "You'll die in the cotton fields like your mother." But the beating didn't break William's spirit, it hardened it. He spent the next year planning more carefully. He memorized routes. He saved small amounts of food. He studied the patterns of patrols and slave catchers. He made contact with free black people who whispered about the Underground Railroad. And he waited for the right moment. It came on New Year's Day, 1834, when Willie sent William to Cincinnati on a business trip. Cincinnati was on the Ohio River, the border between slavery and freedom. On one side was Kentucky, a slave state. On the other was Ohio, where slavery was illegal. William arrived in Cincinnati on January 1st. He completed Willie's business, and then, as night fell, he walked to the riverbank. The Ohio River was frozen, not completely. There were patches of thin ice and open water, but it was crossable if someone was desperate enough. William was desperate enough. He waited until dark, then stepped onto the ice. Each step was terrifying. The ice cracked beneath his feet, water seeped through in places, the cold was numbing. But he kept walking, kept moving toward the distant shore where freedom waited. Halfway across, he heard shouting behind him. Someone had seen him. Slave catchers were running toward the river. William ran. He ran across cracking ice, through freezing water, his lungs burning, his body screaming for him to stop. Behind him, the slave catchers were gaining ground. He was 10 feet from the Ohio shore when the ice beneath him gave way completely. He plunged into freezing water, the shock stealing his breath. For a moment, he thought he would drown, thought this was how his story ended. But then hands grabbed him. Strong hands pulling him from the water. A black man, a free man, had been watching from the shore and had waded in to help. "Come on," the man shouted. "Move, they're almost here." William stumbled onto the Ohio shore, dripping and shaking. The slave catchers stopped at the river's edge. They couldn't legally cross into Ohio without paperwork, but they shouted threats, promising they would find him, that he couldn't hide forever. The black man pulled William away from the river, into the darkness of the Ohio woods. "I'm Wells," William gasped through chattering teeth. "William Wells Brown." The man looked at him strangely. "That's a mouthful. Let's get you somewhere warm first, then we'll worry about names." They reached a small farmhouse where the man and his wife, free black people who helped runaways, gave William dry clothes and hot food. As William sat by the fire, feeling warmth return to his body, he realized something profound. He had done it, he was free. But freedom, he would soon learn, was just the beginning of his journey. Because being free wasn't enough, not while millions remained enslaved, not while the truth about slavery remained hidden or softened for comfortable audiences. William had escaped his chains, now he had to help break the chains that bound others. And he would do it the same way he had survived slavery, with words, with memory, with the stubborn refusal to let the truth be silenced. Cleveland, Ohio, 1835. William Wells Brown had been free for 1 year, and he was learning that freedom came in layers. He was legally free in Ohio, but federal law meant slave catchers could still pursue him. He was free to work, but most jobs paid black workers half what they paid white workers. He was free to speak, but in a nation where the majority believed in slavery, his words were often dismissed or ignored. Still, it was better than chains. He had taken the name Wells Brown to honor the Quaker steamboat captain who had given him that first book, that first glimpse of possibility. William Wells Brown, it was a name that connected his past to his present, that honored someone who had shown him kindness. He found work on Lake Erie steamboats, the same kind of work he'd done as a slave, but now he earned wages. Small wages, but they were his, and he used those earnings to do something that would have gotten him killed in Kentucky or Missouri. He helped other people escape. The Underground Railroad wasn't actually underground or a railroad. It was a network of people, black and white, free and fugitive, who helped enslaved people reach freedom. They used coded language. Safe houses were stations, helpers were conductors, escapees were passengers. William became a conductor. He knew the river routes intimately from his years on steamboats. He knew how to read weather patterns, how to predict patrol movements, how to spot slave catchers, and he was willing to risk his hard-won freedom to help others find theirs. In his first year alone, he helped 69 people escape across Lake Erie to Canada, where British law protected them from being returned to slavery. But William wanted to do more than help people escape one at a time. He wanted to attack the system itself, and he realized the most powerful weapon he had was his story. So he started speaking. At first, it was small gatherings in black churches and abolitionist societies. William would stand before audiences of 12 or 20 people and tell them the truth about slavery, not the sanitized version that white people preferred, but the brutal reality. He told them about his mother dying in Mississippi cotton fields, about his sister being sold away when he was 6, about the beatings, the hunger, the daily dehumanization, about learning to read in secret because literacy was rebellion. And people listened. Word spread about the eloquent fugitive slave who could speak with power and precision about his experiences. Larger audiences requested him. Abolitionist societies in major cities invited him to speak. By 1836, William was traveling throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, giving speeches about slavery and helping coordinate Underground Railroad activities. But he faced a problem that would shape his entire life's work. People didn't believe him. White audiences especially struggled to accept that an enslaved person could be intelligent, articulate, and educated. They had been told their entire lives that black people were intellectually inferior, suited only for manual labor. William's obvious intelligence threatened that narrative. He speaks too well to have been a slave, critics said. He must be an imposter, a free black man pretending to be a fugitive for attention. Some even claimed his light skin meant he wasn't really black, that he didn't represent the true enslaved population. William felt rage at these responses, but he channeled that rage into action. In 1837, he began writing. He wrote articles for abolitionist newspapers under his own name, detailing specific experiences and naming specific places. He couldn't be easily dismissed as an imposter if he provided verifiable details. He wrote about the auction block in St. Louis where he'd been sold, about Dr. John Young's estate in Kentucky, about the steamboats he'd worked on and the routes they traveled, about Samuel Willie's store and the beating he'd received for trying to escape. The articles were published in the Liberator *, William Lloyd Garrison's influential abolitionist newspaper, and they began to change minds. But William's most important work was yet to come. In 1839, he met a woman named Elizabeth Schooner. She was a free black woman, educated and passionate about abolition. They married within months, and Elizabeth became his partner in every sense, helping him organize Underground Railroad activities, editing his writing, managing their household while he traveled for speaking engagements. Together, they had 3 daughters, and William was determined that his daughters would have the childhood he never did: safe, loved, educated, and free. But providing that childhood required money, and speaking to abolitionist societies paid little. So William made a decision that would prove controversial: he would write and sell his autobiography. Slave narratives were becoming popular. Frederick Douglass had published his narrative in 1845 to enormous success. But many abolitionists worried that fugitives writing books would make them too visible, too easy for slave catchers to track. William decided the risk was worth it. He spent months writing, often late at night after his daughters were asleep. He poured his life onto the page: his childhood, his years on the river, his multiple escape attempts, his journey to freedom. But he also wrote about the broader system of slavery, the economic forces that sustained it, the legal structures that protected it. Narrative of William W. Brown, a Fugitive Slave, written by himself, was published in 1847. It was an immediate success. The book sold 8,000 copies in its first 2 years, extraordinary numbers for the time. It was reprinted in England and translated into French. William became internationally known. But with fame came danger. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made William's situation desperate. This new federal law required that escaped slaves be returned to their masters, even if they were found in free states. It denied fugitives the right to a jury trial. It punished anyone who helped runaways with heavy fines and imprisonment. Samuel Willie, William's former master, publicly announced he would pursue William and drag him back to Missouri. The reward for William's capture was set at $500, a fortune that would motivate every bounty hunter in America. "You need to go to England," Frederick Douglass urged him, "at least until this blows over." But William didn't want to leave. He was doing important work with the Underground Railroad. His family was established in America. His daughters were in school. "If I run to England, I prove their point," William argued. "I prove that fugitives can never truly be free in America, that this country will always choose slavery over justice." "Better alive in England than dead in America," Douglass countered. Reluctantly, William agreed. In 1849, he sailed to England, planning to stay for a few months until the controversy died down. He ended up staying for 5 years. In England, William discovered a completely different world. British society had abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, and there was genuine curiosity about American slavery. William was invited to speak at universities, churches, and public halls. He met with members of Parliament, journalists, and social reformers. And he wrote. During his time in England, William produced 3 more books. He wrote 3 Years in Europe *, a travel narrative that contrasted free British society with slave-holding America. He wrote Clodagh, or The President's Daughter *, widely considered the first novel published by an African American, and he wrote plays, poems, and countless articles. But his most important work during this period was something few people know about. He documented the lives of enslaved people in a way no one had before. William had realized something crucial. Most slave narratives, including his own first book, focused on individual stories. They were powerful, moving, personal accounts. But they didn't capture the full system of slavery, the economics, the politics, the interconnected web of laws and customs that sustained it. So he began researching and writing a comprehensive history of slavery in America. He spent hundreds of hours in British libraries, reading everything he could find about the slave trade, plantation economics, legal codes, and resistance movements. The result was a manuscript unlike anything that had been published before. It combined personal narrative with historical analysis, first-hand accounts with statistical data, emotional testimony with cold facts. But no American publisher would touch it. It was too long, too detailed, too critical of institutions that even Northern publishers wanted to avoid offending. So William published it himself in England in 1853. It was titled The American Fugitive in Europe, Sketches of Places and People Abroad, but it was really a comprehensive indictment of American slavery disguised as a travel book. The book contained information that would be considered standard in history books today but was revolutionary at the time. He documented the economic foundations of slavery, showing how Northern banks, shipping companies, and textile mills profited from Southern cotton produced by enslaved labor. He exposed the complicity of churches that preached about Christian values while accepting donations from slaveholders and refusing to condemn slavery. He revealed the hypocrisy of politicians who spoke eloquently about freedom and democracy while owning human beings. He told the stories of resistance, not just dramatic escapes but daily acts of subtle rebellion that most white people never saw. And most importantly, he preserved the voices of enslaved people themselves. He had spent years collecting testimonies, letters, and accounts from fugitives who had made it to freedom. He wove their voices throughout the book, ensuring that the truth of slavery was told by those who had lived it. The book was acclaimed in England but largely ignored in America. Most American newspapers refused to review it, those that did dismissed it as abolitionist propaganda. But William didn't care about immediate recognition. He understood he was creating a historical record, a testament that would outlive the controversy that would ensure future generations knew the truth. While William was in England, something happened that allowed him to finally return home safely. British friends and abolitionists raised money to purchase his freedom from Samuel Willey. In 1854, William Wells Brown became legally free, no longer a fugitive. He returned to America in triumph, but the America he returned to was fracturing. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had just been passed, allowing new territories to choose whether to permit slavery. Violence was erupting between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The nation was hurtling toward civil war. William knew his work was more important than ever. He resumed his speaking tour with renewed intensity, traveling thousands of miles each year, giving speeches in cities and small towns, never stopping, never resting. But he also continued writing, because William had learned something that many activists missed. Speaking changed minds in the moment, but writing changed them forever. He published a revised and expanded edition of his autobiography, including detailed accounts of his Underground Railroad work. He wrote about the economic connections between Northern industry and Southern slavery. He documented specific cases of slave catchers kidnapping free black people and selling them into slavery. And he wrote something that schools still don't teach, the truth about Abraham Lincoln. William met Lincoln several times during the 1850s. And while he appreciated Lincoln's opposition to slavery's expansion, he was frustrated by Lincoln's gradualism, his willingness to compromise, his stated belief that white and black people could never live as equals. Lincoln is not an abolitionist, William wrote in 1860. He is a politician who sees slavery as an economic and political problem, not a moral evil. If we wait for men like Lincoln to free us, we will wait forever. Freedom must be taken, not granted. These words would later be proven both right and wrong. The Civil War did eventually end slavery, but not because Lincoln or any politician decided enslaved people deserved freedom. It ended because enslaved people themselves rose up, fled plantations by the thousands, and forced the issue. William documented this too. During the Civil War, he traveled through Union-occupied territories, interviewing formerly enslaved people, recording their stories of self-emancipation. "They didn't wait to be freed," he wrote. "They freed themselves. The Emancipation Proclamation simply acknowledged what they had already done." After the war, William continued his work. He published more books, gave more speeches, and fought for the rights of freed people. He argued for land redistribution, for education access, for voting rights, for true equality. But he also saw the betrayal of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, the continuation of oppression under new names. In his final years, William became more radical, more angry, more willing to critique not just the South but the North, not just Democrats but Republicans, not just obvious racists but liberal allies who preached equality while practicing discrimination. He died in 1884 at the age of 70, still fighting, still writing, still refusing to let the truth be softened or forgotten. And that's the part schools never mention. Boston, Massachusetts, 1860. William Wells Brown stood in the office of the Boston Anti-Slavery Society holding a manuscript that would make him more enemies than anything he'd written before. He was 46 years old, his hair graying but his eyes still sharp with determination. "You can't publish this," the society's president said, reading through the pages with increasing alarm. "William, this will destroy relationships we've spent years building." "Good," William replied, "those relationships are built on lies." The manuscript was titled The Black Man, His Antecedents, His Genius, and His Achievements. It was William's most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive documentation of black achievement throughout history. But it wasn't the historical content that worried the anti-slavery society. It was what William had written about white abolitionists. For years, William had watched white abolitionists control the narrative about slavery. They decided which black voices to amplify and which to silence. They edited slave narratives to make them more palatable to white audiences. They took credit for escapes that black people had orchestrated themselves. And William was done staying quiet about it. In the manuscript's introduction, he wrote, "The anti-slavery movement in America has been led largely by white men and women who, despite their good intentions, cannot truly understand what it means to be enslaved. They speak of slavery as an abstract moral wrong, but they have never felt the chains, never endured the lash, never watched their children sold away. Their opposition to slavery is intellectual. Ours is existential." He continued, "Moreover, many who call themselves abolitionists still believe in the inherent inferiority of the Negro race. They want to end slavery not because they believe we are equal but because they find the institution distasteful. They are willing to free us but not to stand beside us as equals." These words were explosive. They challenged the very foundation of the abolitionist movement's self-image. They suggested that white abolitionists were part of the problem, not just the solution. "You'll lose funding," the society president warned. "You'll lose speaking invitations. You'll alienate the very people who have supported your work." "Then I'll find new support," William said. "I'm tired of needing permission from white people to tell the truth." He published the book himself. The Black Man was released in 1863, the same year as the Emancipation Proclamation. But while Lincoln's proclamation got all the attention, William's book did something more profound. It challenged the entire framework through which white America understood black people. The book contained 53 biographical sketches of accomplished black individuals, scientists, artists, writers, inventors, revolutionaries. But William didn't just celebrate their achievements. He analyzed why those achievements had been systematically erased from history. He wrote about Benjamin Banneker, the mathematician and astronomer who had helped survey Washington, D.C., whose work had been dismissed because white people couldn't accept that a black man could master such complex calculations. He documented Phillis Wheatley, the poet whose work had been questioned and doubted because white readers couldn't believe an enslaved woman could write with such skill. He told the story of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, the successful slave rebellion that had terrified white America so much that it was barely mentioned in history books. And he exposed the pattern. Whenever black people achieved something remarkable, white society either denied it had happened, claimed white people had actually done it, or dismissed it as an exception that proved the rule of black inferiority. "The narrative of Negro inferiority is not based on evidence," William wrote. "It is based on necessity. The entire economic and social structure of America depends on the belief that black people are suited only for servitude. To acknowledge our intelligence, our creativity, our humanity in full measure would be to acknowledge that slavery is not just wrong, it is an abomination. And that acknowledgement would require white America to completely rebuild its society." The book sold slowly at first. Many white abolitionists refused to promote it because of its divisive tone. Some black leaders worried it was too confrontational, that it would set back the cause. But other black activists embraced it. Frederick Douglass called it necessary truth-telling. Sojourner Truth said it spoke what we all knew but feared to say. And ordinary black readers, both free and newly freed, bought it in increasing numbers. They passed copies between families. They read passages aloud in churches and community gatherings. They saw themselves reflected in its pages in ways they never had before. William continued his dangerous truth-telling throughout the Civil War. While most Northern writers were celebrating the Union cause and praising Lincoln, William wrote critically about the war's conduct and purpose. He pointed out that for the first 18 months of the war, Lincoln explicitly said the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. That enslaved people who escaped to Union lines were initially returned to their masters. That black men who volunteered to fight were turned away. This war is not being fought for our freedom, William wrote in 1862. It is being fought to preserve a nation that includes slavery. Only when enslaved people themselves forced the issue, by escaping to Union lines by the thousands, by making themselves impossible to ignore, did Lincoln reluctantly acknowledge that slavery must end. He documented what he called self-emancipation, the phenomenon of enslaved people fleeing plantations as Union armies approached, creating facts on the ground that made slavery unenforceable. We freed ourselves, he insisted. Lincoln's proclamation simply acknowledged what we had already accomplished through our own courage and action. These writings made William unpopular with many white Northerners who wanted to believe the war was a noble crusade to free the enslaved. They wanted to see themselves as saviors, not as people who had tolerated slavery for decades and only acted when forced to. But William refused to give them that comfort. He insisted on a more complex, more truthful narrative. In 1864, William published another controversial work, The Negro in the American Rebellion. It was a military history of black soldiers in the Civil War, but it was also an indictment of how they were treated. He documented that black soldiers were paid less than white soldiers, $10 per month versus $13, plus white soldiers received clothing allowances that black soldiers didn't. He exposed the fact that black soldiers were often given the most dangerous assignments, used as shock troops in assaults while white regiments were held in reserve. He revealed that captured black soldiers were often executed by Confederate forces rather than taken prisoner, and that the Union military did little to retaliate or protect them. And he told the stories of black soldiers who fought with extraordinary bravery despite this discrimination. Men like Sergeant William Carney, who kept the American flag from touching the ground even after being shot 4 times, becoming the first black soldier to earn the Medal of Honor. The Negro soldier has proven his courage on 100 battlefields, William wrote. But he fights not one war but 2 against the Confederacy and against the discrimination of his own Union army. His enemy wears both gray and blue. These words angered Union military leadership. Some called for William to be arrested for undermining the war effort, but he had too many supporters by then, too much of a reputation. They couldn't silence him without creating a scandal. After the war ended and slavery was abolished, many Americans wanted to move on, to reconcile and heal. William refused. In 1867, he published The Negro in the American Rebellion, his heroism and his fidelity *, an expanded version of his earlier military history. But he added new sections about Reconstruction, about the promises being made to freed people and the betrayals already beginning. He documented the black codes, laws Southern states were passing to restrict freed people's movement, employment, and rights, laws that were slavery by another name. He exposed the violence of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. The murders, the intimidation, the terrorism designed to drive black people back into submission. And he criticized Northern politicians who were already abandoning Reconstruction, already making compromises with former Confederates, already sacrificing black rights for white unity. 4 million people have been freed from slavery, William wrote. But they have been freed into a nation that still does not see them as fully human. They have been given their liberty but denied the tools to live as free people: education, land, economic opportunity, political power. This is not freedom, this is abandonment, and future generations will judge us harshly for it. These words proved prophetic. Within a decade, Reconstruction would collapse, federal troops would withdraw from the South, Jim Crow laws would formalize segregation and disenfranchisement, Black Americans would be left to face violent white supremacy without federal protection. William documented all of it. Even as his health declined and speaking became difficult, he continued writing. He published articles in Black newspapers. He wrote pamphlets about lynching, sharecropping, convict leasing, all the ways white supremacy adapted after slavery's formal end. But he also continued the work he'd begun with the Black Man *, documenting Black achievement and resistance. He wrote about Black inventors whose patents were stolen or suppressed, about Black businesspeople who built successful enterprises despite constant obstacles, about Black teachers who educated freed people with minimal resources. "We are constantly told to prove our worth to demonstrate our capability," he wrote in 1880. "But we have been proving it for centuries in every possible field. The problem is not that we lack achievement, it's that white America systematically erases or ignores those achievements." In his final years, William became increasingly isolated from mainstream abolitionist circles. His unwillingness to soften his criticism, to celebrate partial victories, to thank white allies for their help made him unpopular. But he found a new audience among younger Black activists who were frustrated with the failures of Reconstruction. They read his books, attended his speeches, and carried forward his insistence on truth-telling. One of those young activists was Ida B. Wells, who would later lead the anti-lynching movement. She met William in 1883 when she was just 21 years old. "Mr. Brown told me something I never forgot," Wells later wrote. "He said, 'Never let white people's comfort be more important than Black people's truth. They will always ask you to wait, to compromise, to be patient, but patience is just another word for acceptance, and we must never accept injustice.'" William Wells Brown died on November 6, 1884 in his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was 70 years old. The mainstream newspapers published brief obituaries noting his work as a fugitive slave and author. They praised his contributions to the abolitionist cause and his inspirational life story. But they didn't mention his most important work, the dangerous truths he told about white complicity, about the betrayal of Reconstruction, about the gap between America's ideals and its practices. They didn't mention that he had written 20 books and countless articles exposing not just slavery but the entire system of white supremacy that preceded and outlived it. They didn't mention that he had helped 69 people escape to freedom through the Underground Railroad. They didn't mention that he had been one of the first African Americans to publish a novel, to write a play, to practice medicine without formal training. Because acknowledging all of that would mean acknowledging that William Wells Brown was more than an inspirational story of personal triumph. He was a revolutionary who dedicated his life to dismantling white supremacy through relentless truth-telling. And that was a legacy too dangerous to celebrate. Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1890. 6 years after William Wells Brown's death, his daughters Clarissa, Josephine, and William gathered in their father's study. They were sorting through his papers, trying to decide what to do with decades of writing that their father had never published. There were manuscripts, hundreds of pages of manuscripts, histories, essays, personal reflections. Some were complete works ready for publication. Others were fragments, notes, ideas he'd never had time to fully develop. Josephine held up a leather-bound journal. "Listen to this, it's from 1875, he was 61 years old." She read aloud, "I have spent my life documenting the truth about slavery and its aftermath. I have written books, given speeches, recorded testimonies. I have tried to ensure that future generations will know what really happened, not the sanitized version, not the myths, but the truth. Yet I am haunted by the certainty that most of my work will be forgotten or deliberately buried. White America does not want to remember its sins. And many Black Americans, exhausted by the struggle, simply want to move forward. But we cannot move forward by forgetting. We can only build a just future on a foundation of honest history." The three siblings were quiet. Their father had been right. Already they could see his work being minimized, his most challenging ideas being ignored. "We need to publish these," Clarissa said. "All of them, everything he wrote that hasn't been published yet." But it wasn't that simple. Publishers weren't interested. The country was moving into what would later be called the nadir of race relations in America, the lowest point between the end of slavery and the civil rights movement. Lynching was epidemic. Segregation was being formalized. The Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision would soon enshrine separate but equal as constitutional. In this climate, William Wells Brown's uncompromising critiques of white supremacy were not welcome. Publishers told his daughters the work was too angry, too divisive, not commercially viable. One publisher was more honest. Your father's early work, his escape narrative, his adventure stories, those sold because white readers could feel good about themselves while reading them. They could pity the poor slave and congratulate themselves on opposing slavery. But his later work challenges white readers to examine their own complicity. Nobody wants to pay money to be made uncomfortable. So most of William's unpublished work remained unpublished. His daughters preserved what they could, donating some papers to historical societies, keeping others in the family, but much of it was scattered or lost over the following decades. This is why schools don't teach the full story of William Wells Brown. The version that gets taught is the safe version, the inspiring tale of the fugitive slave who learned to read, escaped to freedom, and became a successful writer and speaker. That story is true as far as it goes, but it's incomplete. The parts that get left out are the dangerous parts. That William Wells Brown didn't just oppose slavery, he opposed the entire racial hierarchy that preceded and outlived it. That he criticized not just Southern slaveholders but Northern allies who claimed to support abolition while believing in black inferiority. That he documented how Northern banks, industries, and institutions profited from slavery, making it a national system, not just a Southern one. That he insisted the Civil War wasn't won by white saviors but by enslaved people who freed themselves through courage and resistance. That he called out the betrayal of Reconstruction and predicted the rise of Jim Crow decades before most people recognized what was happening. That he refused to be grateful to white allies, instead demanding they acknowledge their complicity and work toward genuine equality. These truths are dangerous because they challenge the comfortable narratives white America prefers about its history. They make it impossible to celebrate Northern heroes without also acknowledging Northern hypocrisy. They make it impossible to see the Civil War as a noble crusade without acknowledging that it took enslaved people's self-liberation to force the issue. But William's legacy survived, even if most people don't know about it. His ideas were carried forward by activists who came after him. Ida B. Wells, who led the anti-lynching movement, used William's model of investigative documentation, collecting facts, publishing statistics, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. W. E. B. Du Bois, who wrote The Souls of Black Folk and helped found the NAACP, echoed Williams' insistence that black people should not have to prove their humanity or wait for white approval to claim their rights. Paul Robeson, the singer and activist, repeated Williams' challenge to the narrative that America was a fundamentally good nation that just needed minor reforms. And in the 1960s, when a new generation of activists demanded black power and refused to settle for gradual change, they were unknowingly following the path William had laid out a century earlier. Malcolm X in particular sounded like William Wells Brown reincarnated. His insistence on self-determination, his refusal to thank white liberals for their help, his critique of the entire system rather than just its most obvious symptoms, all of this echoed what William had been saying since the 1850s. But most people making these connections didn't know about William Wells Brown. His books had gone out of print. His most challenging works had never been widely published. His name had been largely forgotten except in academic circles. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s when scholars began recovering the lost history of black resistance that William's full body of work began to be rediscovered. Historians found his unpublished manuscripts in archives. They tracked down copies of his out-of-print books. They began to piece together the full scope of his writings and activism. What they discovered was staggering. William Wells Brown had written approximately 20 books and countless articles over his lifetime. He had pioneered multiple genres. He was one of the first African Americans to publish a novel, a play, a travel narrative, and a comprehensive history. He had documented more than anyone else from his generation the economic foundations of slavery and the systemic nature of racism. Yet while other abolitionist writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe remained famous and were taught in every school, William had been forgot. Why? Partially because his work was too challenging, too unwilling to let white readers off the hook. But also because of something more insidious: the way American history has been taught deliberately minimizes black agency. The standard narrative goes like this: slavery was bad, white abolitionists fought against it, Lincoln freed the slaves, and eventually things got better through civil rights legislation. In this narrative, black people are objects, things to be freed, problems to be solved, recipients of white generosity. They have no agency, no power, no role in their own liberation. William Wells Brown's life and work destroys that narrative completely. He freed himself. He helped free dozens of others. He became educated through his own determination. He built a platform without white permission. He refused to be grateful or deferential. He demanded equality rather than asking for it. Teaching that story would require acknowledging that black people have always been agents of their own liberation, that white allies have often been obstacles as much as helpers, that the progress America has made on racial justice has been won through black resistance, not white benevolence. And American schools have never been willing to teach that truth. So instead, they teach the safe version of William Wells Brown's story, if they teach it at all. The inspiring tale of personal triumph, scrubbed clean of its most challenging elements. They don't teach that he wrote *clodal*, a novel suggesting that Thomas Jefferson had children with his slave Sally Hemings, a claim that was denied for 150 years before DNA evidence proved William was right. They don't teach that he documented the Underground Railroad in ways that directly contradicted white accounts that centered white Quakers as the heroes of those stories. They don't teach that he wrote medical texts while practicing as a physician, challenging the claim that black people couldn't master complex intellectual disciplines. They don't teach that he spent the last 20 years of his life documenting the betrayal of Reconstruction and predicting that without genuine commitment to racial justice, white supremacy would simply adapt and continue. They especially don't teach what he wrote in 1877, the year Reconstruction ended. The Compromise of 1877 is not a compromise, it is a surrender. The federal government has abandoned 4 million freed people to the mercies of their former masters. History will record this as one of the great betrayals of American history, and black Americans will suffer for generations because of it. He was right. Jim Crow lasted for nearly a century. Lynching, sharecropping, convict-lizing, segregation, all the machinery of white supremacy continued unchecked because Reconstruction was abandoned. William Wells Brown saw it coming, he warned about it, he documented it as it happened, and then his warnings were buried along with his other dangerous truths. But in the 21st century, as America grapples with ongoing racial injustice, William's work is being rediscovered again. Scholars are republishing his books. Activists are quoting his words. Educators are beginning to include his full story, not just the sanitized version. Because the truths William Wells Brown told are timeless. The patterns he identified: white supremacy's ability to adapt and survive, the gap between American ideals and American practices, the need for relentless truth-telling even when it's unpopular, all of these remain relevant. His insistence that black people should not wait for white approval to claim their rights echoes in every contemporary movement for racial justice. His documentation of how economic systems depend on racial exploitation remains relevant in discussions of mass incarceration, wage inequality, and wealth gaps. His refusal to celebrate partial victories or accept gradual change speaks to activists frustrated with the slow pace of progress. William Wells Brown was a man ahead of his time. Or perhaps more accurately, he was a man who saw clearly the realities of his time and refused to accept comfortable lies about them. And that's why his story remains hidden in most schools, because telling his full story would require teaching uncomfortable truths about American history, truths about who really won freedom for enslaved people, truths about white complicity in racial oppression, truths about the continuity of white supremacy from slavery through Jim Crow and beyond. Those are truths America still struggles to face. But they're truths that must be told. Boston present day. Dr. Maria Johnson stood in front of her high school American history class holding a worn copy of a book most of her students had never heard of, Narrative of William W. Brown, a Fugitive Slave, written by himself. "Before we start today," she said, "I want to ask you a question. How many of you have heard of Frederick Douglass?" Every hand went up. Harriet Tubman. Again every hand. Sojourner Truth. Most hands stayed up. "Now," Dr. Johnson continued, "how many of you have heard of William Wells Brown?" Silence, not a single hand. Dr. Johnson nodded. "That's what I thought, and that's what we're going to talk about today, not just who William Wells Brown was but why you've never heard of him." She spent the next hour telling William's story, not the sanitized version but the full truth, his childhood in slavery, his multiple escape attempts, his self-education, his work on the Underground Railroad, his writing, his speaking, his relentless activism. But most importantly, she taught them about what made William dangerous, his refusal to soften the truth for white comfort. William Wells Brown didn't just oppose slavery, Dr. Johnson explained. He opposed the entire system of white supremacy. He didn't just want black people to be freed, he demanded they be treated as equals. He didn't thank white abolitionists for their help, he challenged them to examine their own prejudices. She showed them excerpts from William's later writings, his critiques of Reconstruction's failures, his predictions about Jim Crow, his documentation of how white supremacy adapted after slavery ended. One student raised her hand. "If he was so important, why haven't we learned about him before?" Dr. Johnson smiled. "That's exactly the right question. The answer is complicated, but it comes down to this. American history curriculum is designed to make white Americans feel comfortable about their past. It celebrates white heroes who fought against obvious evils like slavery, but it doesn't want to examine the more subtle forms of racism that continued after slavery ended. Teaching the full story of William Wells Brown would require that uncomfortable examination." She continued, "Think about it. We teach about Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. We don't usually teach that enslaved people were freeing themselves by fleeing plantations by the thousands, forcing Lincoln's hand. We don't teach that black soldiers fought in the Civil War despite being paid less and treated as expendable. We don't teach that Reconstruction was deliberately sabotaged, leaving freed people vulnerable to a century of Jim Crow oppression." William Wells Brown taught all of those things. He documented them as they happened. He refused to let people forget or minimize them, and that made his work dangerous to the comfortable narrative white America preferred. Another student spoke up, "But isn't his work available now? Can't people read it if they want to?" "Some of it, yes," Dr. Johnson replied. "His autobiography has been republished. Scholars have recovered some of his other works, but much of what he wrote remains out of print or difficult to access, and more importantly, it's not taught. Most Americans graduate from high school having never heard his name. That's not an accident, it's a choice about what history we consider important to teach." Over the next few weeks, Dr. Johnson's class did a deep dive into William Wells Brown's life and work. They read his autobiography. They analyzed his critiques of white abolitionism. They traced how his warnings about Reconstruction proved prophetically accurate. But they also did something more. They connected William's work to contemporary issues. They discussed how his documentation of the economic foundations of slavery related to modern discussions of reparations and wealth inequality. They examined how his insistence on black self-determination echoed in contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter. They analyzed how his critique of white allies who wanted credit without doing the hard work of examining their own prejudices remained relevant in modern conversations about performative allyship. By the end of the unit, the students understood something profound. William Wells Brown hadn't been forgotten by accident. His work had been deliberately marginalized because the truths he told threatened comfortable narratives about American progress and white benevolence. One of Dr. Johnson's students, a young black woman named Destiny, gave a presentation connecting William's work to her own experience. "My whole life," Destiny said, "I've been taught that racism is about individual bad people doing individual bad things, like slavery was bad because slaveholders were bad people. Jim Crow was bad because segregationists were bad people, and the solution is for everyone to just be nice to each other and not be racist." But reading William Wells Brown, I realized that's not how it works. Racism is a system. It's in economics, politics, education, everything. And it doesn't require people to be obviously hateful, it just requires people to be comfortable with inequality, to not question it, to tell themselves things are getting better even when the data shows they're not. William Wells Brown understood that 150 years ago he kept trying to tell people, and we ignored him because the truth was uncomfortable. Dr. Johnson's class was unusual. Most American students never learn about William Wells Brown at all, and when they do, they get the sanitized version, the inspiring story of personal triumph, stripped of its challenging edges. But across the country, some educators are beginning to teach the full story. Some historians are working to republish William's complete works. Some activists are reclaiming his legacy as a model for contemporary resistance. Because the truths William Wells Brown told are eternal truths. That white supremacy is a system, not just a collection of individual prejudices. That progress is not inevitable, it must be fought for constantly, relentlessly. That black people have always been agents of their own liberation, not passive recipients of white benevolence. That telling uncomfortable truths is more valuable than maintaining comfortable lies. That partial victories are not enough, full equality and justice must be the goal. These truths are as relevant today as they were in William's lifetime. Perhaps more so as America continues to grapple with the legacy of slavery and the ongoing reality of systemic racism. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to recover and celebrate William Wells Brown's legacy. Several universities have created digital archives of his works. Publishers have reissued some of his books. Historical markers have been placed at sites significant to his life. In 2024, a group of activists and historians established the William Wells Brown Institute, dedicated to preserving his work and teaching his methods of documentation and truth-telling to new generations of activists. The Institute's mission statement reads, "William Wells Brown understood that the powerful will always try to control the narrative of history. He dedicated his life to creating an alternative record, one that centered the voices of the oppressed, documented systemic injustice, and refused to accept comfortable lies. We carry that mission forward." The Institute runs programs teaching young people how to document injustice in their communities, how to use historical research as a tool for contemporary activism, how to tell uncomfortable truths without apology. They've published new editions of William's works with modern annotations connecting his 19th century observations to 21st century realities. They've created curricula for teachers who want to teach the full, unvarnished story of American racial history. And they've established a fellowship program supporting activists and scholars who, like William, insist on truth-telling even when it's unpopular or dangerous. But the Institute faces resistance. School boards have tried to ban their curricula. Politicians have accused them of teaching divisive concepts and making white students feel bad about American history. These attacks echo the resistance William faced during his lifetime. The same impulse that tried to silence him in the 1850s is trying to silence his legacy today, the desire to maintain comfortable myths rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Yet William's work survives. His books are being read by new generations. His methods are being adopted by modern activists. His insistence on truth over comfort continues to inspire. In a speech at the Institute's founding, historian Dr. James Carter said, "William Wells Brown understood something that we're still learning, that history is not neutral. The stories we tell about the past shape the present and future. When we teach sanitized history that centers white heroes and minimizes black agency, we reinforce the idea that progress comes from white benevolence rather than black resistance. When we teach the full, complicated truth, including the truths that make us uncomfortable, we empower people to recognize and resist ongoing injustice." William Wells Brown spent his life fighting to make sure the truth survived, not the comfortable version of truth but the whole truth. That fight continues today. And every time we teach his story, every time we read his words, every time we refuse to accept sanitized history, we honor his legacy. On the 200th anniversary of William's birth in 2014, a group of activists retraced the route of his escape from Kentucky to Ohio. They walked the same paths, crossed the same river, and at each stop they read from William's writings. At the final stop on the Ohio shore where William had crossed to freedom, they read his words from 1880. "I have spent my life documenting truth because I believe future generations have the right to know what really happened. Not the myths, not the comfortable lies, but the truth in all its painful complexity. That truth is my legacy. Guard it, teach it, let it guide you as you continue the fight for justice." Those words echo across time. William Wells Brown's legacy isn't just his books or his speeches or his activism. It's the model he provided of relentless truth-telling, of refusing to wait for permission or approval, of documenting injustice even when powerful people want it hidden. His legacy is the understanding that real change doesn't come from making people comfortable. It comes from making them uncomfortable enough to recognize injustice and committed enough to fight it. His legacy is the insistence that Black people are not supporting characters in a story of white redemption, but the central authors of their own liberation. His legacy is the knowledge that the fight for justice is never finished, that every generation must take up the struggle anew, armed with truth and unwilling to compromise. And perhaps most importantly, his legacy is the proof that truth survives. Even when powerful people try to bury it, even when it's forgotten for decades, even when it's deliberately excluded from textbooks and curricula, the truth survives. William Wells Brown's truth survived, and it continues to challenge, inspire, and guide everyone who encounters it. That's why schools never mention the full story of William Wells Brown, because his truth is too dangerous to the comfortable narratives America prefers about its past. But dangerous truths have a way of surviving and demanding to be heard. The end. Author's note, *, the life and work of William Wells Brown deserve to be much better known. This story is based on historical facts about his life, though some dialogue and specific interactions have been dramatized for narrative purposes. His books, including his autobiography, Clodal *, and The Black Man *, are available and worth reading for anyone interested in the full, unvarnished truth about American history.